Well, as you've been hearing, the South African government is to recall its diplomats in Israel for consultation. It says it's disappointed by the refusal of the Israeli government to respect international law and its continued undermining of the UN resolutions for the implementation of a ceasefire. What will this mean for relations between the two countries now and in future? Is it the correct move? Professor Andre Thomashausen, a UNISA Professor Emeritus of International Law, joins us now. Professor Thomashausen, good evening and welcome. The South African government outlined its reasons for making this move. It's decrying the fact that the humanitarian corridors for the Palestinians remain closed with dire consequences, specifically for women, children and innocent victims, referring to the airstrikes of Israel on the occupied territories as genocidal. How do you evaluate this decision?
Well, for starters, I would like to recall that South Africa is famed for its soft power diplomacy. It avoided major conflicts, for instance, in Zimbabwe 20 years ago. Our soft power approach reflected the fact that South Africa is conscious that it is just one of 250 United Nations member states, and for that a very small and not a very successful one. So it is good for a small member of the international community to be cautious, to make small steps. And this is now a big step. It rushes ahead of what actually any other country except, I think, Algeria and Turkey have decided to suddenly break off diplomatic relations, because it's not just calling back the skeleton staff that is still in Israel, but it is also the intent to ask the Israeli ambassador to leave. So this is quite brusque, and it is definitely not going to help a very, very large double nationality population in Israel and also here in South Africa. We forget that we have a very large Jewish population in South Africa that are in key positions in commerce and industry and in banking, Discovery, Investec Bank, many others. I don't have to name them.
You call it a small move, and if I heard you correctly, you said it's not really going to help. First of all, I mean, there are other countries, Bolivia, Honduras, you mentioned Turkey already, Colombia, Chile, Bahrain, Jordan, amongst others, who are doing and enacting similar action. And as you say, in terms of what it really means, perhaps it's also just looking through the lens of history to see where countries stood, if in the final analysis this is deemed a genocidal move. Minister Pandor has said this recall is normal to get one's officials back, to get a full understanding and determine what the relationship would look like going ahead. In March, we had downgraded to a liaison office in solidarity with the Palestinians. Where do you see our diplomatic relations going, given the moves our government is making?
Well, definitely it's not going to change anything in the battlefield, whether there's a South African representation or an Israeli ambassador in South Africa or not, is not going to change anything. A more constructive approach would have been for South Africa to, for instance, try and negotiate a settlement around the hostages. There's still over 200 hostages lingering somewhere underground in some tunnels, most of them built under hospitals and schools. So that is really what a mediation could have focused on, because I suspect the military operation in Gaza could end in return for the release of the hostages. But on the purely legal front, of course, South Africa is free to entertain relations with whoever they wish. And international law is not like national law. There is no international police. There's no international enforcement. The only next step in this conflict could be the composition of an international peacekeeping force that moves into Gaza, that is sufficiently equipped, and of course would be composed of major powers and not really see a South African participation.
Professor Thomashausen, again, you reiterate the point that, this is more symbolic, really. It's not going to have any impact on whether airstrikes continue, whether there will be a humanitarian ceasefire. And, you've suggested alternative options that the government could have enacted. But one of the things you do say is that, and which seems to support the official Israeli line, that these assets, these, terror assets are built under key civilian installations, and we have had interviews which, asking for where the proof of this might lie, and I would love for you to share that with our audience, why you believe that is the case, and you support that the Israeli position that this is the reason why they're targeting the assets that they are targeting, because Hamas has made vulnerable places where civilians are either in hospital, in the schools, or in the places of worship.
Well, this evolves around the principle of proportionality, which applies in any use of force. It is part of humanitarian law. And yes, of course, civilians may not be targets of military efforts. Ever since the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, where there were no military objectives, humanitarian law agrees that civilians may not be targets. But at the same time, civilians may not be hostages, and civilians may not be used as human shields, especially not against their will. And it does appear that very large numbers of people living in Gaza City who want to move into safety some 5-6 kilometers south were stopped from doing that. So this is an extremely difficult situation now.
Where's the proof, though, Prof? I just want to get to this part, which is what I was actually...
230 hostages who are not combatant, who have nothing to do with any military actions, and accept that they can malperish. This is untenable. If we would imagine that the Lesotho, who for a long time have claimed that most of the Free State is part of the Lesotho traditional territory, if Lesotho were to go and take 230 hostages in somewhere in Maung or wherever and hide them.
Yeah, but I'm asking a very
under
specific
dam,
question, Prof. Sorry, let's just not stray. And I have to stop you there because I want to keep it focused on this. I'm saying that is a common line, and for you to educate our audience as well, is to just say, as an academic, what do you rely on as proof that human beings, civilians, or innocent people are being used as as human shields, and that in fact, this is what's happening. There's this major network of tunnels built under civilian assets, which Israel has the right to attack. Just share that so that we can educate our viewers as well.
No, of course, we can only read what is in the news and what is in the press, and we can also apply common sense. Why would Israel do things that would bring the entire world opinion against it unless they are really forced to do it? And it's a principle in law. If you have a person with a trigger for a nuclear device in an ambulance, and you know that this person might kill a considerable number of innocent people, so what do? Do you let him do it, or do you stop that ambulance and that trigger? This is a normal situation in self-defense appreciations.
I think you'd have a lot of debate there. That
wouldn't do this lightheartedly.
All right. It will be, and I would love for us to debate that last point that you made, that this would be normal in sort of self-defense, when the whole, a massive part of the world, even those in the United Nations who have access to a lot more information, empirical information, would argue against that point. But let's set it up for another conversation in future. And thank you for your time this afternoon. Professor Andre Thomashausen is UNISA Professor Emeritus in International Law.